So here we are in the garage, putting the first coat of primer on the floorboards. I got the bottom sides done and the edges done. Now I'm just sealing tops. We gotta get this completely sealed so that it's resistant to the water, and resistant to all the sun damage and mildew and all that stuff. And this plywood is soaking up a lot of primer. So if you tried to paint without it, it wouldn't work very well. And it probably wouldn't seal very good, and you'd suck up a ton of expensive paint. So it makes a lot of sense to take the time, even though it's a hassle, to really put a good solid layer of primer on all this plywood. It'll make it last a lot longer. So I'm using Kills primer, which is good for indoor and outdoor, and it really is good at sealing the wood. I'm only showing you one side because it takes a little while, but you really have to work it in. You got to get it into all the side grain of that plywood and all the notches, because that's where it's going to be most likely to separate and easiest to get in trouble. So you really got to seal it. And I did 2 coats on everything. Coat it, flip it, let it dry, get on the edges, and then do it again. Here we are in the garage with all the components to the floorboards, the transom, the benches, and everything is now been primed with 2 layers of primer and sanded. So at least the surface that's going to be important is nice and smooth now. Everything's been blown dry and everything is sealed. So now we're ready to paint. The floorboards are the biggest piece of wood, and then the transom and the benches. So I got a can of this special paint that's specifically designed to go right on aluminum without having to prime it. That'll go on the boat, but I don't think that's going to stick very well to this kind of primer. So we're going to use regular Rust-Oleum enamel spray paint for the floorboards and the benches and the transom. And because it's been primed really well, the wood is sealed, this will just give it the protective cover and the color. So that's the project for today. The day I did the priming, the reason I was in the garage is because it was really windy. And anytime you paint anything, if there's a lot of wind and a lot of particulates in the air, they will stick to the paint. So you get little pieces of sand and grain and leaves and dust and whatever. So in order to prevent that from getting stuck into the primer, I shut myself in the garage and did all that day. This day was much nicer, and there was no wind. So I set everything up outside because I didn't want to get overspray on everything. And I was using canned spray paint as the top coat. So you kind of have to figure out how far you can get in coverage with how many cans you have. And I bought a kit. It was a camel colored kit that is designed specifically for boats and that kind of stuff. And I figured out which colors I was going to use on floorboards and which colors I was going to use on benches, and figured out how far I could get that to cover, and then set it up on some sawhorses and just started going through the process of spray painting. And like I was saying before, one of the things you have to be kind of meticulous about is making sure you get it into those notches, because they're the places that are going to get the most weakness for the water to get in between the layers of the wood. So I kind of went around each one of these first and got all the notches, and then covered the top surfaces one surface at a time. I also went through each of the separate components all the way around each edge, covered all the surfaces, and then I'd go back over them and make sure that there was no gaps in the paint. Sometimes just because of a little bit of wind or the way the spray can works, it would look good from one side, but if you turn it around the other way, you could actually see the white coming through from the primer underneath. So I tried to make sure I filled in all the gaps. Tried to make sure everything was completely coated and sealed, including down into all the screw holes, because I wanted them to make sure that if water got around all that stuff, it wasn't going to leak down into the wood. So I tried to get everything completely sealed and covered up, and use as much of the paint as I could. Once it was all covered, I went back and used the rest of those cans of paint to make sure that any spots or thin points were cleaned up. And then each piece was hung up by the wires to dry in the garage where nothing could get stuck to it. Now, all of the wood pieces are painted. You got the transom, you got the 3 benches, got the inner piece of the transom, we got the internal shelf, we got the floorboards and the tip floorboards. Everything is coated and painted and sealed. I'm going to leave the bottoms of those just in double layers of primer because there's no sense in putting paint on the bottom where nobody's going to see it. It's sealed up. It would just add weight. And the wood is ready to go, except one piece I realized I forgot was these flotation canisters. So in the old boat, the way they set it up so that if you got full of water, these hold enough air to hopefully keep the boat from sinking. So they were all corroded, they were all bent, they were all covered in spider webs and dirt and mold and crap. So I took a wire drill and ground them all off. I scraped out all the old caulking, and you can see down in here all these corners are open and they'll take on water. So I'm going to have to use some of this caulking material. I found some good caulk. So I'll go through and seal all those edges. Let that set up so that when I paint the boat, I can paint these and they'll all match. So that's what we're doing next. When you get a new tube of this caulking, you have to cut the tip, and the size of the hole you cut determines how much will come out at a time. So I was trying to cut this so that I could get a nice bead. And the other thing I've learned with these is that a lot of times what's in there isn't mixed up really well right at the end. So it's good to get the air bubble out and bleed a little bit about that out at the front so that you don't get a weird goop. So I went in and tried to start to just seal each of those corners, specifically making sure I packed it down in the 90-degree corners the most because that's where it was going to be open in each one of those. And I had to do both ends of both of these metal cylinders. So I went through and quickly caulked a bead and used a gloved finger to spread that in there and make sure it was sealed and evenly distributed, and then a nice surface that I could eventually come back and paint over. Now the other thing I did is I took this transom cover that was covered in the spray paint like that and put a coat of coater over the top of it because there's going to be a motor sitting on here and it's going to bang and get flipped over in the dirt, and it's going to take a lot of abuse, and that's going to be very tough. That's a very good solid protective coating for the wood too, so it can be used that way. I think that's going to work out really good. I've decided to use what's left of my coat it and what's left of my accelerator, and I'm going to cover the wooden floorboards and the benches the same way I covered the transom pieces. They turned out really good. They're going to be really strong, nice and protected, and I think it'll make this stuff last a lot longer if we do that. So now we have coated above the paint on the floorboards, on the benches, on the transom, on the deck shelf, and all of the floor tips. So when that sets up, it'll be much more foot resistant, much more wear resistant, much more temperature, weather resistant. So we'll see how it works out, but I think coat it is going to make this boat last a lot longer. This is what the paint looks like dry right out of the can. It's kind of a flat matte finish. This is what it looks like with a single layer of the coat on top. The coat makes it a little more shiny. It makes it a little more of a glossy surface, but it also has a little bit of a stippled finish from the particles that are in there. And I think it's going to make it a lot more abrasion resistant and a lot more water resistant. So now all these pieces are done and they're ready to get set up for assembly.